The room went quiet the moment she walked in. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that happens when something appears that doesn't fit, and every instinct in the room registers it before the brain catches up. She was 5'4". She carried a green duffel bag that looked older than most of the men standing around her. She had no unit patch on her sleeve, no name tape visible, nothing that told the assembled soldiers who she was or why she was there. She set the bag down next to a folding table, unzipped it with the same unhurried motion someone might use unpacking groceries, and began arranging her equipment without looking up once. Her name was Lena Varek. She was 31 years old. Nobody in that room knew what that name meant yet. The exercise was called Iron Meridian. It was a joint evaluation held once every 18 months at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, a cold and colorless place in early March, where the ground hadn't fully thawed and the wind came off the tree line with enough bite to make men pull their collars up. The purpose of the exercise was straightforward on paper. Assess advanced marksmanship under dynamic field conditions, wind, distance, moving targets, stress-induced physiological variables. The Army wanted to know which soldiers could perform precision shooting when their hands were cold, their heart rate was elevated, and the situation around them was designed to look nothing like a range. 41 soldiers had been selected. They came from 4 different installations. They ranged in rank from specialist to staff sergeant, with 2 exceptions, a master sergeant named Callum Doyle, who had been sent as an observer, and Lena Varek, whose rank was listed on the intake form as W2, warrant officer, which placed her technically outside the normal chain of command for the exercise and created, from the first morning, a small but persistent administrative confusion that several of the men chose to interpret as something else entirely. The lead evaluator was a man named Staff Sergeant Derek Cobb. Cobb had been running Iron Meridian evaluations for 3 cycles. He was good at his job in the way that men who have never been seriously challenged sometimes are completely, and without the kind of self-examination that challenge tends to produce. He had thick forearms, a competent bearing, and a habit of standing with his weight slightly forward, like he was always about to say something important. When Varek walked in that first morning, he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't budgeted time for. "Varek," he said, reading from the clipboard. "Lena Varek." "That's me," she said. He looked up. He looked at her. He looked back at the clipboard. "It says here you're coming out of the 160th support element." He said the words with a particular flatness that managed to be almost neutral while communicating something that was not neutral at all. "That's correct. The 160th is a rotary wing unit." "Yes. This is a ground marksmanship evaluation." Varek looked at him. "I'm aware of what the evaluation is." Cobb held her gaze for a moment, then made a small mark on his clipboard and moved on to the next name. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that taken alone means nothing. But in a room of 40 soldiers who have been together long enough to read each other's frequencies, that clipboard mark landed like a statement. The man standing to Varek's left, a specialist named Tyler Oakes, leaned toward the soldier beside him and said something behind his hand. The soldier beside him, a compact, wide-shouldered man named Brandt, smiled without moving his face much. The kind of smile that doesn't need an audience, Varek noticed. She noticed the way people who have spent a long time being underestimated tend to notice things completely and without showing it. The first day of Iron Meridian was administrative and familiarization. Soldiers zeroed their weapons on a standard 100-meter range, ran through equipment checks, received briefings on the evaluation structure. Varek did all of this without incident. She was quiet during the briefings. She asked one question, a technical question about wind measurement protocol, specifically whether evaluators were using kestrel readings at the firing line only or also downrange, and the question was precise enough that the evaluator answering it paused for a moment before responding. Cobb watched that pause. He filed it somewhere. The second day was when things began to move. Iron Meridian's first practical exercise was a 600-meter qualification shoot. Moving targets, variable exposure windows, crosswind conditions that the weather had helpfully provided at around 12 knots from the northwest. It was not a beginner's course. The pass threshold was deliberately set above what standard qualification required. Roughly a third of the soldiers were expected to struggle. The soldiers shot in pairs, rotating through the firing positions in a sequence Cobb had arranged. He had placed Varek in the third rotation between Oakes and a staff sergeant named Paul Renner, who had the most confirmed long-range qualifications in the group. Whether the placement was intentional was the kind of thing that was impossible to prove and easy to suspect. Renner shot first. He was very good. His group at 600 meters was tight. His timing on the moving exposures was precise. And when he stepped back from the firing position, he had the calm of a man who had done exactly what he expected to do. Several soldiers near the line acknowledged him with the kind of nod that functions as a small applause. Oakes shot second. He was adequate. Not exceptional, but within the pass threshold, and he came off the line with enough energy to suggest he was satisfied. Then it was Varek's turn. She stepped to the position and took approximately 45 seconds to settle before firing her first round. 45 seconds is a long time at a firing line, long enough that Cobb checked his watch, long enough that a murmur moved through the group of soldiers observing from the staging area. What she was doing during those 45 seconds was not hesitating. She was reading. The grass at 400 meters was bending at a consistent interval. The flag mounted at the 500-meter mark was doing something slightly different. A 2 to 3 second lag in its recovery that indicated a variable in the mid-range corridor that the Kestrel reading at the firing line wasn't fully capturing. She was calculating a correction that had not been provided in the range data. Then she fired. The first target, a steel silhouette at 600 meters with a 4-second exposure window, registered a hit at 0.8 seconds into its exposure. The second target, a cross-traversing silhouette at 580 meters, was hit at the leading edge. What shooters call a first-round cold barrel hit on a moving target at that distance, which is a thing that sounds simple and is not simple at all. The third target came up at an angle that placed it partially behind a berm for the first 1.2 seconds of its exposure window, and she held and fired at the precise moment the center mass became available, and the steel rang. By the time she stepped back from the position, the scoring evaluator had stopped writing and was looking at his own numbers the way a person looks at a figure they're not sure they transcribed correctly. Cobb walked over. He looked at the score sheet. He looked at Varek. She was wiping her bolt with a small square of cloth, not watching him. "You've done this course before," Cobb said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Varek said. "The hold on target 3 was a deliberate red." "Yes, that correction wasn't in the range data we provided." "No," she said again. "It wasn't." There was a beat of silence. Cobb's jaw moved in a way that had nothing to do with speech. "We'll rescore after the full rotation," he said, and walked away. The rescore produced the same numbers. Varek had the highest single rotation score of the day. It wasn't close. That evening, in the barracks common room, the soldiers who had been quietly filing away their impressions of Lena Varek began, collectively and somewhat reluctantly, to update them. Not all of them. Brandt, who had smiled behind his hand on day 1, sat at a table with Oakes and 2 other soldiers and ran through a series of explanations. Equipment advantage, favorable wind timing. The scoring evaluator had been lenient. It was 1 day and 1 rotation. Let's see how she does under fatigue. There was, in the specific architecture of those explanations, something that revealed more about the people constructing them than it did about Varek. Varek, for her part, was sitting alone at the far end of the room with a notebook open in front of her. She was not making notes about the day's shooting. She was working through a ballistic calculation, a scenario she had invented for herself. A 100-meter shot in a 15-knot crosswind with a 200-foot elevation drop and a target moving at walking pace. Because that was what she did in the evenings, not because she was preparing for a specific event. Because the math was something she genuinely loved. This is a thing about Lena Varek that the people around her consistently failed to understand. Her skill at long-range precision shooting was not the product of obsessive military dedication or competitive intensity or even especially rigorous training, though she had done all of those things. It was the product of the fact that she found the underlying physics of it beautiful. The way a bullet's flight path is essentially a calculus problem. Drop, drift, spin stabilization, the Coriolis correction at extreme distance, was to her the same kind of satisfying as a proof. She had grown up in a small town in western Pennsylvania where her father had taken her deer hunting at 9 years old, not because she'd asked, but because he'd run out of other ideas for occupying her summers, and by 11 she had started correcting his hold. She never told anyone that story. It didn't seem relevant. Day 3 of Iron Meridian introduced what the evaluation called the dynamic stress protocol. The DSP was the part that broke soldiers who could shoot perfectly well on a standard range. The structure was 3 kilometers of terrain movement in full kit, followed immediately by a 90-second transition window, followed by a precision shot at a target distance that wasn't revealed until the shooter reached the firing position. The idea was to measure performance when the body's cardiovascular system was fighting the requirements of precision. Heart rate elevated, hands not fully steady, breathing not fully controlled. The target distances in past evaluations had ranged from 400 to 900 meters. This cycle, Cobb had set the distance at 950. When the soldiers saw 950 meters posted at the firing position, there was a specific kind of stillness that moved through the group. Renner, who was standing near Varek, said nothing, but his expression said something. Oakes, behind him, said that's new, to no one in particular. Varek looked at the distance marker, then looked at the wind indicators, then began her 90-second transition. The first soldier through the DSP that morning hit at 700 meters equivalent. The target was set up in 2-stage segment, and the score was calculated proportionally. The second soldier, a well-regarded staff sergeant from Fort Bragg named Whitmore, nearly missed the transition window entirely and rushed his shot. Fragments, not a qualifying score. By midday, the average score across 14 rotations was running 22% below what Cobb had seen in previous cycles. He made a note. He did not adjust the distance. Varek ran the 3 kilometers in 38 minutes in kit, which was not the fastest time that morning, but was in the top quarter. She came into the transition window breathing hard, settled to the ground with 12 seconds elapsed, and spent the next 41 seconds doing something that the evaluator standing behind her later described as completely still, except she was breathing in a pattern. She was using a technique, controlled respiratory suppression, timed to the natural cardiac interbeat interval, that is taught in a small number of advanced programs and is not part of standard Army marksmanship training. She had learned it from a manual she'd found in a PDF database 2 years earlier and had spent 6 months teaching it to herself on weekend mornings at an indoor range outside of Clarksville. At 53 seconds into the transition window, she fired. The target at 950 meters, a 10-inch diameter steel disc on a pivot mount, rang once and spun. The evaluator behind her didn't say anything. He wrote a number on his sheet. Word moved through the staging area in the particular way that information moves when it is surprising and people aren't sure how to process it. Not loudly. In low voices with a quality of people double-checking what they'd heard. Cobb found out 3 minutes later. He walked to the scoring station and looked at the sheet himself. He stood there for a moment, just a moment, and then said, "Wind was favorable." He said it quietly, not to anyone specific, but 3 soldiers heard him say it, and all 3 of them knew, even as he said it, that the wind had been running at 11 knots with irregular gusts, which is not what anyone with experience would describe as favorable conditions. That evening, Cobb did something he hadn't done before in 3 cycles of Iron Meridian. He requested a documentation review of Varek's qualification records. This is worth pausing on, because the review itself was unremarkable. Varek's records were in order. Her qualifications were legitimate. Her evaluation scores from previous assignments were exactly what they were, high consistently, in a way that had been noted and filed, and then, in the particular way that institutions sometimes process things that don't fit their existing categories, not acted upon. She had applied for 2 advanced programs. She had been waitlisted for both. The notes on file did not say why. The people who had made those decisions were no longer in the positions from which they had made them, and there was no mechanism to ask. What the documentation review did produce was the following. Cobb showed the records to Master Sergeant Doyle the following morning before the day's evaluation began and said, "Something doesn't add up." Doyle read the records. He handed them back and said, "Everything adds up fine." And Cobb said, "You know what I mean?" And Doyle, who did know what he meant, said nothing, which was not the same as agreeing. Day 4. By day 4 of Iron Meridian, the social geometry of the group had shifted in a way that was visible if you knew how to read it. Soldiers who had said nothing to Varek on day 1 were now saying things. Asking questions about the respiratory technique, about the wind correction method, about where she'd done her early training. A specialist named Greer asked if she'd be willing to walk him through her pre-shot routine, and she did, for about 20 minutes before the morning session, standing at the edge of the range with a patience that surprised him. Renner watched this from a distance and said nothing. He was not a bad man. He was a man doing the math on something and not fully liking the result. Brandt had stopped making the smile. He had replaced it with a careful neutrality that was almost identical in expression, but completely different in kind. The Day 4 evaluation was a scenario exercise, a simulated Overwatch position, 2-person teams, 1 shooter and 1 spotter, a sequence of targets that appeared at irregular intervals across a 300 to 800 meter field. The teams were assigned by roster, and by roster, Varek's assigned partner was Oakes. Oakes had spent 3 days revising his position on Lena Varek and had arrived at something complicated. He had watched her shoot. He was not a person who could watch what she'd done at 950 meters and maintain the explanation that it was luck or favorable conditions. He had shot competitively enough to know the difference between lucky and skilled. But he was also a person who had spent 3 days in a group where the ambient frequency on the subject of Varek was set to a particular channel, and 3 days is long enough for a frequency to become a habit. He decided, on the morning of day 4, that he would be professional. He would do his job. He told himself this with enough deliberateness that it was noticeable to him that he had to tell himself. The scenario exercise went well for the first 2 target sequences. Oakes spotted, Varek shot. The communication between them was functional, if not fluid. Then, on the 3rd target sequence, Oakes gave a wind call that was wrong. Not badly wrong. 0.4 mils off, a small error in a moderate wind, but wrong in a direction that, if followed, would have put the shot outside the scoring zone. Varek held. She ran the call herself. She made the correction without announcing it. She fired. The target registered. Oakes looked at his data and then looked at the target. He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't use my call," he said. "Your call was off by 0.4, Varek said. She wasn't confrontational about it. She stated it the way someone states a measurement. Oakes was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "Show me." And she did. She pulled out her notebook, the same one she'd been working in that first evening, and walked him through the wind, read the indicator sources she'd been tracking, the calculation. Oakes followed it. He was a better man in that specific moment than he had been for the previous 3 days, because what he said next, instead of arguing, was, "Okay, I was off. Got it." That small moment, quiet, witnessed by no one in particular, containing nothing dramatic, was, in some ways, the center of what Iron Meridian was actually measuring. But that was not the moment the exercise would be remembered for. The moment the exercise would be remembered for happened on day 5 at 2:47 in the afternoon, in front of 38 soldiers, 2 evaluators, Master Sergeant Doyle and Staff Sergeant Derek Cobb. The final evaluation of Iron Meridian was called the Capstones. It was a single-shot event, 1 round, 1 target, 1 opportunity. The target distance was sealed in an envelope that was not opened until all participants were at the firing line. The conditions were whatever the conditions were. There was no practice. There was no second chance. The previous cycle's capstone distance had been 750 meters. Cobb opened the envelope. He read the number to the group, 1,100 meters. There was a silence that had a specific texture to it, not shock exactly, but the particular stillness of people recalibrating. 1,100 meters is, under field conditions, with wind, at the end of a 5-day evaluation that had accumulated physical and cognitive fatigue, a very serious number. At that distance, a standard 7.62 NATO round has been in the air for more than 1.5 seconds. In that time, the Earth has rotated slightly beneath it. The wind has touched it at every point in its flight. The shooter's heartbeat, if not managed, will move the point of impact enough to miss. There is no forgiveness at that distance. The math is exacting in the way that only physics can be. Soldiers shot in reverse order of their cumulative scores, which meant the highest scorers shot last. Varek would shoot second to last. Renner would shoot last. The first 15 soldiers shot. 3 hit. The others were close, some very close, but close at 1,100 meters is still a miss. Cobb had been walking the line. He'd been present and procedural, doing his job. But as the rotation progressed and the hit rate stayed low, something in him, some combination of the week's accumulating frustration, the documentation review that had produced nothing actionable, the particular feeling of a person who expected a certain order and had watched it quietly fail to materialize, that something surfaced in a way that was not wise. When the rotation reached Varek's position, Cobb was standing approximately 8 feet behind the firing line. He was not required to say anything. The protocol did not include commentary from the lead evaluator during the capstone. Varek, he said something anyway, was level, professionally level, in the way that professional levelness sometimes functions as its own kind of pressure. 1,100 meters, field conditions, end of day 5. A pause. This is where the evaluation separates training from actual capability. He was not technically saying anything inappropriate. Every word was defensible. But the 38 soldiers at that firing line knew what he was doing, and they knew it in the specific, calibrated way that people who have spent their lives in institutional hierarchies know when a thing is being done and why. Master Sergeant Doyle, standing at the edge of the line, looked at Cobb. Cobb did not look back. Varek said nothing. She settled to the firing position. She went through her routine, the breathing sequence, the read, the stillness that looked from the outside like someone who had simply stopped. The wind at 1,100 meters was doing 3 things simultaneously. A base current from the northwest at 9 knots, a thermal uplift from the tree line on the right side of the range that was affecting the mid-range corridor, and a surface-level variable near the target that she had been tracking for 40 minutes. She had been tracking it for 40 minutes because she had known, since day 3, that the capstone distance would be at the far end of the envelope, and she had spent the time between rotations watching the downrange environment the way a person watches something they intend to understand completely. The calculation she ran in those final seconds was not dramatic. It was arithmetic, the same arithmetic she had been practicing since she was 11 years old in western Pennsylvania, when she had first understood that the space between a shooter and a target is not empty but is instead a medium with properties, and that those properties can be read, and that reading them correctly is a form of respect for the truth of how things actually work. She fired. At 1,100 meters, in the conditions that existed on that range on that afternoon, the sound of a steel target being struck arrives approximately 3.2 seconds after the shot. The group at the firing line was quiet for those 3.2 seconds. Not the quiet of people waiting politely, the quiet of people who have stopped doing anything else. Then the sound came. It arrived as a single flat, unambiguous ring that crossed the range and reached the firing line with the clarity of a note played on a bell. And then for 1.8 seconds, which the evaluator later confirmed because he had been counting, there was nothing, no voice, no movement, just 38 soldiers and 2 evaluators and a master sergeant and a staff sergeant standing in a field in Massachusetts in early March, in a stillness that had the quality of something being understood. Then sound returned to the world, and several things happened at once. Renner, who was next in rotation, said, in a voice that was entirely matter-of-fact, "Okay, then." Greer said something that was half a word and half not a word. Doyle turned to look at Cobb. Cobb was standing with his clipboard at his side, not writing. His face had the expression of a man looking at a sum that has come out to something other than what he expected, and not yet certain what to do with that information. He would have several days to figure it out, because Iron Meridian concluded the following morning with a formal after-action and award of scores. Varek's cumulative score for the evaluation was the highest in the group. It was the highest capstone score in the 3-cycle history of the exercise. Renner scored second. He congratulated her directly, with a handshake that had nothing performative about it, and she thanked him in a way that acknowledged the gesture without making more of it than it was. The formal commendation that followed Iron Meridian was processed through standard channels. It took 11 weeks, which is a normal amount of time. The commendation recommended Varek for inclusion in the Army's Advanced Marksmanship Instruction Program, the same program she had been waitlisted for twice without explanation. This time, the recommendation was signed by Master Sergeant Callum Doyle. It was also, notably, co-signed by Staff Sergeant Derek Cobb. This fact, Cobb's signature on that document, was the thing that Doyle later said he hadn't expected. He mentioned it once to a colleague, saying only that it had surprised him. His colleague asked whether Cobb had said anything when he signed it. Doyle said he didn't say much. He looked at the page for a while. Then he signed it. Whether that constituted an acknowledgement or an apology, or simply a man doing the correct procedural thing for reasons he kept to himself, that was not recorded anywhere. It existed only in the specific quality of the silence that Doyle had observed, and the pen moving on the page, and whatever Cobb had worked through in the space between those two things. Varek received her notification 8 weeks after the commendation was filed. She was at her duty station. In the middle of a morning she would later describe, if asked, as entirely ordinary. She read the notification. She set it on her desk. She finished the coffee that had gone cold while she was reading. Then she picked up the notebook, the one with the wind calculations, the ballistic problems she'd invented for herself, the evening arithmetic, and opened it to a new page. She had for a while a habit of writing a number at the top of each new page. Not a date, a distance. The distance that represented, at that particular point in her work, the edge of what she knew she could do, and what she was still learning to do. The number had moved steadily over the years, in one direction. She wrote a new number at the top of the page. Then she started working.